All right. If there aren't any questions on anything, we'll just pick up where we left off on Monday, talking about epithelial tissue. Of the human body. Our first tissue to discuss is simple squamous. Okay, so we learned these terms the other day. Simple means what? Anybody? One layer. Okay, so there's a single layer of cells, and squamous tells you the shape, which is flat, squashed, if you want to think of them that way. So first, the bullet here is a single row of flat cells, which permits diffusion of substances. Okay, because these cells are so squashed, so thin, it's easy for stuff to pass through them. That's what I mean when I say diffusion of substances. Okay, so we find them in places like our lungs, where we need to bring oxygen directly from our lungs into the blood without much trouble. Okay, we find it inside our heart, our blood vessels, lymphatic vessels. Okay, in that area of the body, we give that type of tissue a special name, endothelium. Okay, if it's inside of the serous membranes of the pericardium and pleura that we talked about the other day, okay, it's called mesothelium. You've probably seen commercials and heard commercials where they say if you suffer from mesothelioma, okay, we know what I'm talking about. If not, apparently you don't watch as much TV as I do. Okay, but mesothelium would be what's in trouble in that situation, cancer of that. So it's the same type of tissue, just gets a special name in some certain places. Here you can see what we have here in our box are 3 different illustrations to show the same thing. Now, I shouldn't even say illustrations because these are real pictures under a microscope. Okay, this first one, it's kind of hard to see. I'll zoom in at the picture. Follow my cursor across where my little hand is going. Okay, that little line there, all the way this thin segment of our picture, that's the simple squamous. You can see it when you zoom in. It's probably pretty difficult to see on your page. All this squiggly line stuff, that would be connective tissue deep to it. Okay, this picture here shows you what it looks like from a different angle, a surface view. Okay, pretend that you're looking at a piece of paper, or I'll just pull a piece of paper up like what I'm holding right now, where you're looking at the paper on its flat edge, right? Okay, if you look at this piece of paper, can you tell how many layers it is? How many pieces of paper am I holding? You can't tell, right? Okay, but if I turn the paper sideways, you're looking at it at a different angle, which is what the picture on the right is really kind of showing you. Okay, a section from kind of above looking to the side of it. Okay, where we can see a very thin layer of cells. It looks like there's probably 2 cells that form this capillary, which is a blood vessel. Okay, you can see how thin they really are. It's going to be an easy way for substances to leave and enter our bloodstream. Okay. Now, on your exam next week, you will be required to know these pictures. Several of them will show up. These aren't pictures that you'll find in your labeling packet. As far as pictures go, I'm not going to worry about this one or this one. If I choose to put a picture on the exam for simple squamous, it would be this one. Okay, so make sure you know that one of the 3. Our next tissue is called simple cuboidal. Once again, simple means 1 layer thick. Cuboidal tells you the shape is cube or kind of square shaped. Typically, these cells have microvilli. Remember, those are little finger-like extensions, allowing for absorption, secretion, to push stuff out or bring it in, like mucus, which can be pushed out. A lot of our glands and tubules, like the liver, thyroid, mammary, salivary glands, have this. Bronchioles, which are in your lungs, kidney tubules, which are obviously in your kidneys, which are what are shown here at the bottom of the page. Okay, this hollow space is where we will be filtering urine and forming in that urine. That's enclosed by way of that simple cuboidal layer of cells. You can see nice and cube-shaped, one layer thick. Now here on the right side of the page, you can see, for example, these two layers are right next to each other, so it might confuse you and make it look like there's two layers, okay? In all actuality, if you were to like draw a line right down the middle of them, okay, that would be like this tube over here, this tube over here. So they're actually just next to one another. So this one's kind of confusing, so I would not worry about this box, just this picture for the simple cuboidal. Okay, simple columnar tells you that you've got a single row of tall, narrow cells, kind of like what we saw with cuboidal. A lot of absorption secretion taking place. There's two forms, ciliated and non-ciliated. Remember, cilia are the tiny little hair-like structures that help circulate things. Okay. Here in our picture, if you look at this picture, you see the little red line going across where the number 9 is. That's the basement membrane. Remember, that's that non-cellular material that separates epithelial tissue from connective tissue. So like down here where number 6 is, that's all connective. So from here at number 9 all the way to the tip out here, that's our single layer of tall cells. Okay. A lot of the cells are very nice and column shaped. These ones that look kind of more like a football, number 7, are actually examples of non-ciliated, what we call goblet cells. We have goblet cells wherever we produce mucus. That's what they do. So places like the inside of our GI tract, so that's like our stomach, intestines, inside our respiratory tract, reproductive, so on and so forth. And we also have non-ciliated, what we call columnar epithelial cells that have microvilli in our GI tract, ducts and many glands, gallbladder, to secrete. We look hard enough at this red line up here at the top, that tells you where the cell ends, but there's some stuff coming off of it where the number 8 is. That would actually be cilia. Can't really see the wispy hairs, but those would be cilia to help circulate stuff in places like respiratory tract, uterine tubes in females, so on and so forth. We can see the cilia in this bottom picture a lot better for what we call our pseudostratified. Okay, pseudo, remember, means what? What? False. Good. Okay, so it looks stratified, which stratified means multiple layered. Pseudo-stratified, therefore, means it looks like there's many layers, but in all actuality, there's not. Okay, in this picture, this red stuff down at the bottom, that's connective tissue. So from where my cursor is going across, outward to here where you can see the cilia, this is all pseudo-stratified. Looks like there's, probably at least 2 to 3 layers in there. Remember, we talked about how like some of the cells, like this is one number 12, you can see where it comes to a point right there. So it's shorter than the one next door. Okay, and then the nucleus is down there versus up here, which gives that false appearance of multiple layers. Okay. There's ciliated and non-ciliated forms. Places where you have ciliated would be like the upper respiratory tract. Here you can see the cilia really nicely. In our ducts of many glands, epididymis, which is in the male reproductive system, and the male urethra, there's non-ciliated forms as well. Now, as far as the exam goes, you're not going to have to know, okay, so where's the ciliated form, where's the non-ciliated form, and just know the just general features and then the pictures. And a lot of these pictures will show up. And these pictures, I would put the picture off to the side of the page and I'd give you like 4 or 5 choices to choose from. So multiple choice style for these. All right, that's it for our single layer of epithelial type tissue. We'll now move on to multiple layered epithelials, which includes stratified squamous. And there's a word here at the beginning called keratinized. We also have a second form of stratified squamous called non-keratinized. It all relates to the presence or lack thereof of keratin, a very important protein that gives good strength to the keratinized stratified squamous. There is no keratin in non-keratinized stratified squamous. Okay? Keratin provides waterproofing, but more importantly, it's resistant to friction, so it's tough. Okay? And so we find this in places like the outer layer of our skin, what we call the epidermis. In our picture here on the right, or the left side of the page, excuse me, this kind of red squiggly stuff, that's the dermis, that's connective tissue. It's this kind of dark blood red. And then this squiggly looking like lines in our picture, okay? This is actually a picture of your skin, which we'll talk about our skin in our next lecture. It's really kind of hard to tell the shapes of the cells, but there are many, many, many layers of flat plate-like cells, okay? These wispy looking things are actually dead cells that we're constantly shedding off, okay? Anytime you rub your skin, scratch your skin, you're flaking off these dead skin cells that are full of this keratin, okay? And the whole function is to kind of keep stuff out, okay? It protects us, it's really strong, our skin's pretty tough. So it's a barrier to organisms and retards water loss. Kind of gross to think about, but a lot of the dust that collects in our house is actually dead skin cells. So pretty gross, but that's what it is. So. Okay, over here on the left side of the page, here in the middle, is you really can see the flatness to these cells, the non-keratinized stratified squamous. One key feature of them is that they create a moist, slippery layer, which is obviously not the case for our skin, which is nice and dry. Okay, sometimes unfortunately too dry. But we find this in like the inside of our mouth. That's what oral mucosa is. The outside of our tongue, we all know those are very nice and moist. Female vagina, so on and so forth. Okay, key feature here is that flat plate-like cells, many layers thick, without the presence of keratin, hence the name non-keratinized. All right, stratified cuboidal tells us that we've got at least two, sometimes more layers of cube-shaped cells. Okay, these are fairly rare. It's not like some people have them and others don't. It's just that there's not a lot of them in the body or a lot of examples where they're at. Found in some of our adult sweat glands, esophageal glands, and our throat, part of the male urethra. Looking at our picture, it's this kind of purple area of our picture. You can see a layer of cells that lines this duct, and then there's a second layer just outside of it, maybe even a third layer, so that makes it stratified. Similar to stratified cuboidal in that there's not a whole lot of examples of this in the body, pretty uncommon. Stratified columnar. It is multiple layers of tall column-shaped cells. Find it in large excretory ducts of some glands, like the esophageal glands. Esophagus is the tube that carries food to our stomach. Anal mucous membrane, part of the conjunctiva of our eye. So from number 12, number 12, where that little red line is, the basement membrane out to this point. You can see it looks like one layer tall, maybe a second layer, and then maybe even a third layer, but at least two layers So that makes it stratified columnar. Okay, transitional is not telling you the shape of the cells, but instead is telling you that the shapes are capable of changing or is variable or transitional, hence the name. Like I was telling you the other day, they can be kind of cube shaped in one situation, but then flattened out. So really you need two pictures to show, okay, like here we can see nicely kind of cube shaped, another layer of cube shaped, whereas down here they've kind of flattened out a little bit more. And this permits what we call distension, which what's distension mean? You might know. Means an organ can stretch, essentially. Okay, two major organs do that, our bladder and our stomach, right? Okay, that's what allows our bladder and our stomach to fill up, obviously with different things, urine for the bladder, food and beverages for the stomach. Okay, our last form of epithelial tissue is called glandular epithelium, which forms glandular cells lying deep to covering lining epithelium. It functions to secrete, which is what glands do. Okay, let's define what a gland is. A cell or group of highly specialized cells that secrete substances. Okay, they're going to secrete them into a duct, which is like a tube, onto a surface, you know, whether that's like the surface of the skin, or in some cases just directly into the blood. Okay. So we classify glands into two categories, exocrine and endocrine. We're going to talk more about exocrine glands in our next lecture. This is what like your sweat glands are. Your oil glands, those are both important glands in our skin. Salivary glands are also exocrine, so are a lot of the digestive glands. The key feature of exocrine glands is that they have a duct connected to them. So that's a tube that carries their secretion, in the case of our skin, to the surface of our skin. Or in some cases like to the inside of the stomach or something like that, inside your mouth for saliva. Okay. Endocrine glands, we'll talk about the endocrine system, like the thyroid gland that's pictured here, which is where we create what's called hormones inside of the cells. Instead of a duct that's connected to them, the hormones just secrete out into the interstitial space, the space between cells, and then the hormone is picked up by the blood. So it diffuses into the blood and then gets carried far away in a lot of cases. Here's an illustration to show what the inside of the thyroid gland looks like. Really, it's no different looking than what we saw with simple cuboidal. So kind of a tricky one, but that's what glandular epithelium looks like. Like I said, we'll talk more about glands, especially the exocrine ones, in our next lecture, because our skin is home to some of our most important ones. All right, that's it for epithelial tissue. So now we can move on to connective, which is very different from epithelial tissue. Okay, we said that epithelial tissue was tissue where the cells were closely adhering. And we saw that with all those pictures where the cells were right next to each other, either in one layer or many layers, like, you know, on our skin and stuff like that. Okay. Key features of connective tissue is that the cells are widely separated. So it's like you guys are spaced around this room. They are socially distanced, if you want to think of them that way. Okay, where there's big spaces in between them. The space is occupied by what's called extracellular matrix. Extracellular matrix is just, as it says, material located between the cells, made up of two kind of major things. Ground substance, which is unstructured material, so it's a lot of fluid and that kind of stuff in many cases. And then fibers. Fibers are the three things that you wrote down in the middle of the page there, those three things: collagenous, elastic, and reticular. We'll get to those here in a minute. As far as connective tissue, it's the most abundant and most variable type. Okay, comparing connective tissues to one another is kind of difficult because blood is very different from fat and very different than cartilage and very different than bone. They're very different. So there's a lot of diverse functions, connecting organs, giving support and protection, storing energy, producing heat, moving, transporting materials, and providing immune responses. One key feature that all connective tissues have is that they're made up of cells, and we can trace our origin back embryonically, like we were talking about the other day, to the mesoderm. Remember, that was the middle layer that I colored in on the thing that looked like a Pac-Man. Okay, this is where we give rise to many of the type of connective tissue cells. Each major type of connective tissue contains an immature class of cells with a name that ends in the suffix blast, which I've given you 3 examples: fibroblasts, chondroblasts, osteoblasts. These immature cells have the capability to undergo cell division and are what are responsible for secreting that extracellular matrix, where they then can differentiate into mature cells, where they then take away the blast ending and end in site. Instead of osteoblast, it becomes osteocyte. Okay, for whatever reason, they don't do that for all of them. Fibroblasts, chondroblasts, that's their name, no matter what. Okay, type of connective tissue cells vary according to the type of tissue and include those fibroblasts I was just mentioning. Large flat cells with branching processes are the most numerous of all of our connective tissues, or connective tissue cells, I should say, and are found in most of our connective tissues. Adipocytes are a fancy way to describe our fat cells. They store what we call triglycerides. We'll talk about them a little bit more here in a minute. Mast cells are abundant alongside blood vessels serving connective tissue, produce a chemical called histamine that dilates our small blood vessels as part of an inflammatory response. These guys are kind of annoying, especially right now for many of us, because they are a big reason why we have allergies. What is a medicine that you take to get rid of allergies? Antihistamines, right? Okay. Histamine, the chemical they produce, causes us to sneeze and that kind of stuff. They may be also involved in ingesting, so like swallowing and killing bacteria. So they are good in their own right. Also very important for protecting us are 5 different types of white blood cells. Typically, we don't find them in significant number in normal connective tissue other than our blood. But what's cool about white blood cells, they can actually leave the blood and enter connective tissue if, we get a cut or something like that and bacteria has made its way inside. Macrophages, I always tell students, these are like our body's actual Pac-Man cells that run around and chew stuff up, swallow bacteria, viruses, and that process is called phagocytosis. Plasma cells are the cells that produce our antibodies, something that's very important, especially right now with everything that's not wrong, but well, I guess you could say that as well, with the virus that's plaguing the world. Let's talk about the fibers. These are unique in their own right and give special properties and make each of our connective tissues different from one another. Collagenous fibers made up of collagen, which you maybe have heard of before, which is a very strong tensile protein. Think of it like a rope that has been woven with many smaller strands, and together it's really strong. These fibers are used in areas like tendons, bones, ligaments, deeper layers of our skin. Reticular fibers occur in networks and provide support for small structures like capillaries and nerve fibers. They're composed of collagen but are more highly branched. And then when you see the word elastic, what's that kind of trigger in your brain immediately? Stretch, right? Like a rubber band, but what happens when you let go of a rubber band? Snaps back, okay? Elastin is the protein that is a component of our elastic fibers, allowing for certain structures to stretch and then hopefully recoil like a rubber band. We find them in our skin, our lungs, and our arteries, which are things that must expand, but also snap back. Unfortunately, as we get older, those elastic fibers start to kind of wear out like a waistband when you pull your shorts up, and they like to fall down. That's why grandma's arm skin hangs off the bottom of her arm, and we get wrinkles and that kind of stuff. Now, to try to get rid of wrinkles, what can people do? Get injections of collagen, actually. And synthetic collagen that can then be used in their face or whatever to make them look young again. Because of the diversity of cells in extracellular matrix and the differences in their proportions, classification is murky and several classifications exist. So what I've done is provided you the outline that your textbook goes with. Listed there, number one, are the two types of embryonic connective tissues. I'm not going to worry about you knowing those because there are so many others of the matures that I'm going to have you know. Picture on the right is just showing you kind of nicely how spread out those cells are from one another with the ground substance and fibers, part of the extracellular matrix in between. I'm not going to worry about the picture because it's not important. Let's start with the three loose connective tissues. The first is called areolar. Sometimes you'll see it listed as loose connective. Which you can see in the picture on the left side here. It actually just has areolar in parentheses. To me, I always tell students it kind of looks like my 4-year-old took some colored pencils and tried to draw something. Squiggly lines and dots and just no real purpose and direction. Okay. Key features of areolar connective tissue. It's got all three fibers. They're loosely arranged, big abundant matrix, provides passageways for nerves and muscles. We'll actually find this, and we'll talk about this in our next lecture when we talk about the hypodermis, which is underneath our skin. Reticular is a loose network, and it's called reticular because it's got reticular fibers, and that's the only type of fiber, so it doesn't have collagen or elastic fibers in there. Find them in our lymph nodes, our spleen, and our bone marrow, and they kind of help with supporting blood cells and that kind of stuff. One cool thing they do in our lymph nodes, they kind of act like a spider web, and they help trap stuff as it passes through our lymph nodes, like viruses and bacteria, so that our white blood cells that are in our lymph nodes can kill that virus, bacteria, whatever it is. And then our final type of loose connective is adipose tissue, which is just a fancy way to describe our fats, okay, which contains cells called adipocytes, which we said are specialized cells that store triglycerides. Key feature of this type of tissue, it looks like you've got these big blobby cells that have nothing inside. Okay, it looks like there's no nucleus. If you look hard enough though, the nucleus is just kind of pressed up against the side of the cell, up against the plasma membrane. And that enables the cell to maximize its interior for storing fat. That big space in there is just all fat. Okay. Now, most of the time we're going to assume fat is a bad thing, okay, because we're ingrained with that. But fat is actually a beneficial thing. Okay. We have it underneath our skin that insulates us. It surrounds some of our organs. It's very important in our body. Unfortunately, it can be bad at the same time if we have too much of it. All right, let's talk dense regular connective tissue, which is our next. You'll see sometimes it's listed as dense regular and then collagenous in the middle. Key feature of this, and you can kind of see it, but we have very densely packed cells, but really what's really super important is the fibers, collagen, hence the name collagenous in parentheses there. And the key feature of this, is that the fibers are all running in the same direction, okay? We can kind of see that, kind of looks like wood grain, where they're all running in the same direction, okay? Those lines are all going the same way, which is described as being parallel to allow for great tensile strength in things like our tendons and ligaments, which tendons hold our muscles to our bones, ligaments hold bones to bones, like the ACL and the knee, okay? Now, the key feature of them is, you know, if you pull on this end and this end like a rope, pulling end to end on a rope, it's really strong. Okay? If you grab a rope and you pull side to side, okay, the rope would kind of come unwoven, right? Okay? You pull on this direction and this direction across instead of this direction, end to end, okay, that could cause rupture of this type of tissue, and sometimes, unfortunately, tendons and ligaments do rupture. So that's dense regular. We also have dense irregular connective tissue. Dense irregular connective is different from regular in that the collagen is randomly arranged. So there's no parallel arrangement. The fibers are just kind of running in all different directions. And so if you pull on this side and this side, or that side and that side, or angled any different direction, it's going to provide good strength in those different directions, as it says right there. It's found in the deeper layer of the skin, what we call our dermis, to enable our skin to stretch a little bit, but also to, you know, still be strong and prevent skin from ripping. It's also found in the pericardium that surrounds our heart, that membrane that we talked a little bit about previously. And then finally, our last of the dense connectives is elastic connective, or you'll see it listed as dense regular elastic in parentheses. I'll just call it elastic connective. And it's like the top one there with collagen, except it's elastic fibers and elastic connective tissue. Makes sense, I hope. Okay. The squiggly lines you can see very nicely here, kind of think of them like kind of an accordion. Okay. Where, you know what an accordion is, right? That musical instrument that can stretch and then push back together to make those funny noises. This type of tissue allows for stretching like a rubber band, but also recoiling. So these squiggly lines, if stretched, would flatten out, as you guys hopefully can imagine. Found in our lungs, walls of some of our arteries, some of our respiratory pathways, vocal cords, and even some ligaments. Make sense? So hopefully you can tell those pictures apart without too much trouble. That's important for next time, or next week, I should say. All right, let's talk cartilage. Different from other connective tissues because it's composed of only one cell type, what we call chondrocytes, which produce fibers, and the tough extracellular matrix, which is unique to cartilage. Fibers of cartilage form a dense network of collagen elastic fibers embedded in a gel-like ground substance. Blood supply to cartilage is actually very low, so nutrient supply is also very low, and that unfortunately results in difficulty fixing itself when cartilage gets damaged. The most abundant of our cartilages is called hyaline cartilage. It's very rubbery, where there's clustered chondrocytes, which are these little things that almost kind of look like a football. Sometimes they kind of pair up. You can see that's always kind of something you see with cartilage for whatever reason. Fine collagen fibers are found in hyaline. We find this at the ends of our long bones to provide for a slippery surface so bones aren't like grinding on one another as they move. It forms a growth plate within our bones. Our ribs are connected to our sternum this way, the tip of our nose, and most of our respiratory system. Elastic cartilage is like hyaline, but since the name is elastic cartilage, it has elastic fibers, which provides flexibility and elastic support. Like in the external ear, which, you know, if you were like me and were bad as a kid, mom or dad would twist my ear. Thankfully, it snapped back to its regular position and didn't stay where it was at. And then a flap in our throat called the epiglottis prevents us from choking when we swallow food. Our last form of cartilage is called fibrocartilage, which is like hyaline, but more extensive collagen fibers, making it resistant to compression and can absorb shock. This is what's found between our vertebrae, called intervertebral discs. Anybody ever heard of your meniscus before? We've got 2 of those in each of our knees. That is cartilage in this type, specifically fibrocartilage. Between our hip bones is what we call the pubic symphysis. We'll talk about all those later on in the semester. All right, our final types of connective tissue I just threw in here on our last slide. Not that there's really any specific reason other than I just wanted to save paper. Didn't want to have to put blood and lymph on a separate page because there's not a whole lot on this page about bone. Bone and blood and lymph are all very different from one another, especially bone from those other 2. Bone is also known as osseous tissue, form of very hard connective tissue. Mature cells of bone are called osteocytes, which are embedded in a unique matrix material containing both collagen fibers and mineral salt crystals. Mineral salt crystals would be calcium and phosphate, which are where really great strength to our bones come from. And we can see that here. Matrix of bone is very similar to cartilage, but it's harder and more rigid due to those mineral salts. There's actually 2 types of bone. Compact bone is what's shown here on the left side. Spongy bone is over here on the right side. Don't think of spongy like soft like a sponge, but as we'll see here in a few lectures in unit number 2, spongy bone actually looks like a sponge where it's got these holes in it. Okay, whereas compact bone does not have the holes in it like what we see there on the right side. A lot of people are kind of surprised to find out that the inside of our bones is actually hollow, so our bones aren't like solid all the way through. The outside of our bones is actually a thin shell of what we call compact bone, which is the strongest form of bone. It's what provides the great strength to our bones. Our bones are made up of living cells, and so they need nutrients. And so there's holes actually within the compact bone. You can see there's one if we zoom in on it. The center of what's called an osteon, where blood vessels and nerves and that kind of stuff travel through the bone. Interior to the compact bone is the spongy, or what we also will see as cancellous bone. This is in red here, the actual bone. The space in between kind of here, more white, is where you'd find like your bone marrow. Okay. It gives internal support to the bone, but it's not nearly as strong as compact bone. We have an entire lecture dedicated to what's called bone tissue. That's the name of the lecture. So we'll talk more about those things. Actually, I think next Friday. All right, let's talk blood. Connective tissue exists in a liquid state, does not contain any fibers. Fibers would be bad in our blood because it could cause our blood to clump and clot. Okay, that's not a good thing. Blood cells are suspended in an extracellular matrix we call plasma. Plasma is the fluid plus other stuff you can actually donate for money if you're ever in a pinch. The cells of our blood include erythrocytes, which is the fancy way to describe our red blood cells. That's what RBCs is short for. Those are the majority of the cells in our blood. As you can see, they don't look red here, but they instead look gray just because of the picture. but I promise you they are red in real life, and that's why our blood is red when we get a cut and it comes out of us. You can see those are the most numerous of all the cells. They carry our oxygen and carbon dioxide. There's 5 different types of leukocytes or white blood cells, which WBC is short for. They provide us with immunity. That's what this one is, an eosinophil, lymphocytes, basophils. There's 2 other types that aren't shown here. Not nearly as numerous as our red blood cells. And if you look hard enough, you can see these little dots, which are platelets. Fancy word for those are thrombocytes, which are involved in blood clotting. Those are actually not even cells, but what's left over when a cell breaks into pieces, which is cool. I don't have a picture of lymph, so you won't have to worry about that, but it's another form of a liquid connective tissue, specifically found in our lymphatic vessels. It contains several types of cells and a clear liquid extracellular matrix, similar to blood plasma, but there's a lot less proteins there. Composition of lymph varies from one part of the body to another. All right, now before we totally move on from connective tissue, we have to talk about epithelial membranes, which tie together epithelial tissue and connective tissue. All right, let's define what an epithelial membrane is. A continuous multicellular sheet composed of a combination, and I would highlight this, epithelial layer and an underlying connective tissue layer. Okay. So an epithelial membrane is made up of 2 types of tissues. Epithelial obviously is one, since the name epithelial. Connective is the other. Since there's 2 tissues involved, technically an epithelial membrane is considered an organ. Okay. 4 types exist. The first is called a mucous membrane or mucosae. It lines a body cavity that opens directly to the exterior. It's like the inside of your mouth, inside of your anus, respiratory or general tracts as well. And the function of a mucous membrane is, in many cases, but not always, to secrete mucus. Yeah, you don't probably or didn't already know this, I imagine, but saliva is not just water. It's also got some mucus in there and that kind of stuff, which helps with lubricating. Okay. The difference between a mucous membrane and a serous membrane is that a serous membrane does also line a body cavity, but here's the key phrase: it does not open directly to the exterior. So these are cavities like the thoracic cavity we talked about, the abdominal pelvic cavity we talked about the other day, covering the organs that lie within the cavity. These are the serous membranes we talked about the other day. The 2 layers between them is the space, okay, pericardium, pleura, peritoneum. Okay. Cutaneous membrane is a fancy way basically to describe your skin. And I shouldn't even say basically, it is a fancy way to describe your skin. Covers the entire surface of our body, consists of a superficial portion, what we call our epidermis. That's the epithelial. Deeper portion is the dermis. Key feature of our skin is it's dry. None of these other ones are dry. And then a synovial membrane is a membrane that is found associated with our freely movable joints, which can be as complicated as like our knee and our shoulder, or as simple as like the joint that exists between the tip of your pinky and the middle part of your pinky, where we have motion occurring and we need lubrication. This lubrication comes from the synovial membrane. The lubrication is called synovial fluid. A key feature, though, of synovial fluid or synovial membranes, they don't have an epithelium, only areolar connective tissue. Pictures at the bottom are just showing you the examples of them, not something I would worry about studying for the exam. Just the information. All right, we've got time probably here with this last slide, and then we'll have one more slide to finish on Friday. So we did our first two general types of tissue. We've got two left, muscle on this page and then nervous on the final page. Three types of muscle exist: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. All three share properties, one of which is that when they are stimulated, and stimulated by a nerve impulse is what I'm talking about, they contract or shorten, which enables them to perform mechanical tasks requiring physical chemical force. Things like moving your limbs, which you guys are doing to write your notes, pushing blood through a vessel, digesting food with your stomach sloshing around, so on and so forth. Okay. When you think muscle, probably going to think of things like your biceps and your quads and your calf. You're thinking of skeletal muscle, called skeletal muscle because it's attached to our skeleton and is what moves our bones in many cases. Not always, like in your face, they provide facial expression instead of moving things and move your skin. Key feature of skeletal muscle, and you can kind of see in the picture, it looks like it's a little bit fuzzy, okay? Though that fuzzy appearance is actually because it is what we call striated. It has little stripes in it. Okay, it's really kind of crazy, cool. We'll get into when we talk all about muscle tissue and mostly skeletal muscle in that lecture here in unit number 3. Okay. Key features of the skeletal muscle cells: they're long. The cells actually run the entire length of the muscle. They're cylindrical, so they kind of look like a tube. And they're unbranched, okay, which is different than cardiac muscle, which is short but also branched. Okay, cardiac muscle, which is only found in our heart. Once again, cardiac tells you we're talking heart here. Is also striated. Okay, the striations, the little fuzziness is not nearly as apparent as it is here, but I promise you there are striations there. Probably the most distinguishing feature of cardiac muscle are these little lines that you can see periodically. Those are called intercalated discs. Okay. Those are only found in cardiac muscle, and they are thickened parts of the plasma membrane. Smooth muscle is called smooth because it is not striated. Okay. They look like a really flattened, long football. Okay, that's what this word fusiform refers to. Their shape, big fat nucleus in the center. They can form into sheets of muscle found in like the inside of our stomach, in the middle of our blood vessels, respiratory tract, the uterus in a female, many, 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 many places interior to us. All right, we'll call it a day there. We'll finish up on Friday with nervous tissue, which will take us just a couple minutes.